Witch of Calamity, Demon Diablos, the original progenitor. Aurora is known by many titles, and each of them tell us quite a bit about her and her past, and yet there's still so much about her that we actually just don't know. Aurora is who I consider to be the most important character in the entire series of Eminence and Shadow. Not because she's my favorite, but rather because of all the implications that these titles and the stories that surround her hold. I'm just kidding, it's actually definitely about her being my favorite character, but all the other things are also cool too. Anyway, she was stated by the creepy priest guy Nelson to be the Calamity Witch, somebody who, quote, rained chaos and destruction down on the world. Which, to be perfectly honest, sounds very similar to how Iris would describe Shadow in this modern era. In fact, there are tons of similarities between Aurora and Sid that I will be mentioning later, and to be honest, the very next one actually kind of has to do with that too, but this one has to do more so with her connection with the demon Diablos. It's stated that Aurora is, quote, also known as the demon Diablos. Now, I definitely look too deep into things, that's for sure, but I did find it a bit odd that they didn't just come out and say that she was the demon Diablos, but rather that she's known as the demon Diablos. It makes it almost seem like perhaps that was more of a title rather than a state of being or a demonic transformation. I mean, we even hear of people refer to Shadow as simply a demon at times, which is yet another similarity, but could be a sign that Aurora wasn't actually as bad or evil during her time as they would like us to believe. It's possible that Aurora in her past was very similar to Sid, where she was perhaps misunderstood or maybe didn't have any real goals and just did whatever she wanted. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Before we get too much into the speculation, we need to discuss more of the things that make up her and her past and the importance of her in current events. You see, as I mentioned before, she could also be referred to as the original progenitor, though to call her a vampire would likely be incorrect. It's more like she created the vampires rather than actually was one. Also, something I didn't notice until recently was actually that all the important vampires we meet during the Lawless City arc all have red hair. Which, I don't know if that's actually significant or what that exactly means for characters like Iris or, I mean, Christina Hope kind of has pinkish hair, but I don't know, it's like close enough to red. But regardless, it was something that I noticed and I thought it was kind of funny, so decided to mention it anyway. But regardless, back to the important stuff. Now, from what we can gather from Aurora's horrible explanation between the differences of vampirism and possession, which being terrible at explaining things is also a similarity she shares with Sid, funny enough. Anyway, what we can gather from her incoherent ramblings is that, similar to how evolution can be explained as a form of adaptation, so too can both possession and vampirism. They seem to come from the same source, that source being the demon Diablos, or rather Aurora. The key differences being that different people adapted to being exposed to her DNA or magic differently. So vampires are for sure connected to Aurora, but how are possessed? Aren't they people who have ties with the heroes? Well, yes. But my theory about where possessed blood comes from actually ties into what we know about both Aurora and the heroes. You see, we know that Aurora was a part of some facility during her childhood, and that facility was likely the Sanctuary. But we also know that the heroes were also experimented on as children in the Sanctuary by the cultists. Now, what the timeline looks like with these things, we don't know for sure, but I assume that Aurora likely came before the heroes, since she was seen mostly alone during her flashbacks, whereas we know the heroes were experimented on in groups. Now, if vampirism and possession comes from the same source, being Aurora herself, it's fascinating thinking about how the different paths adapted to her power. I mean, vampires likely became addicted to it. That's why they must drink blood in order to gain more access to power. Whereas possessed had an even more negative reaction to it, causing them to be overwhelmed with the large amounts of magic being introduced into their bodies, which then led to it being clogged in their pathways and created the magical tumors that we see possessed suffer from. It's also important to note that possessed are only ever female. it's impossible, as far as we know, for a male to become possessed. However, vampires can be either male or female, and besides the vampire Queen Elizabeth, there aren't any signs of either male or female vampires being inherently stronger than the other. Next, I would usually discuss powers and abilities, but I'm actually going to not discuss Aurora's powers and abilities, at least not too much, because to be perfectly honest, they drastically change based on the version of the series that you consume. Like, for example, she's seen using a scythe in everything except the anime, and then in the anime, she's seen attempting to use I Am Atomic. But in the light novel, she says that she wouldn't even be capable of slowly building up magic like how Sid did in the Sanctuary when he kind of absorbed it all into his eye. Not to mention that her blood magic is sometimes described as tendrils, and then other times it's described as spears, so it can be a little bit confusing there. And it's also said that she prefers to keep her distance in a fight, but then in her fight against Sid, she uses her scythe to like perfectly counter him closing the gap on her, and then force him to not only block the attack, but also use a tactic that he himself says he rarely uses to then defeat her at not even her own true strength. So anyway, now that I've poorly explained most of everything that she's seen doing, I'm now going to move on to some of my speculations on where she comes from and how she could be connected to Sid. You see, I've already mentioned some of the similarities that she shares with Sid, like how people viewed her and how people view Shadow, or even their more aloof personalities and terrible explanations. But honestly, they could share even more similarities than that. With how strong Aurora is described, it's almost possible to assume that she was so incredibly strong that no one during her time could fathom her strength, similar to how nobody in the modern era can understand Shadow's strength. Now, because of these similarities and the many things incoherently rambled throughout this video, I now come to my main theory about Aurora. You see, Aurora was reincarnated as well. Now, this may seem like a no shit Sherlock moment, or I mean, I don't know, maybe I did blow your mind a little bit, but probably not. I mean, after all, the evidence is kind of all over the place, but there are two different worlds that I think she could have come from, one more likely than the other. You see, the knight that is definitely not beyond men, Mordred, tells us that this world wasn't always a magical one, and that it was a collision between world lines that caused magic to be introduced into this new world. From this, we could then assume that the science-y things that we see the cult use come from an era before magic, and that perhaps they became obsessed with Aurora and the demon Diablos because they came from a different world, a world with magic. It would explain how she is so much stronger than anyone in her era, but it doesn't explain one major thing. While horribly explaining possession and vampirism to Claire in her mindscape, Aurora mentions a research colleague that discussed theories of evolution, which would imply that at some point she was a researcher, which also implies that she was a woman of science, not magic. My theory is that she actually was some sort of researcher in her past life, probably from the same world line as Sid, possibly even from Japan, then got reincarnated somehow in this new world after magic was introduced. Where the magic comes from is likely from the same world that gave it to Sid's old world, the world of Ragnarok. And sometime after magic was introduced, Aurora was reincarnated and found that she could use magic. Being a past researcher, she then became quite good at using magic, and then was noticed by researchers in this new world, researchers that would later become known as the Cult of Diablos. Aurora, being a past scientist herself, decides to trust them and take part in their experiments. However, these tests are much more cruel than anything she could imagine, and she was left crying a lot, alone and scared of what might happen to her. Out of sheer terror and malice, she lashed out and began destroying everything to escape her captors, eventually making it out, and being finally free to roam this new world. However, the newly formed cult still had all of her DNA, and was able to restore their experiments with new test subjects. Eventually, the cult would take revenge on Aurora for destroying everything and would come to blame her for any and every destructive thing that they would later do. And eventually, they would then send the heroes out to defeat her. But they were unable to completely destroy her, and so they trapped her body and soul in various places throughout the world to continue their experiments and use her blood to live forever. Now, is this theory flawed? Yeah, probably, absolutely, but I do think it's incredibly fun to speculate about Aurora's character since she's so elusive and enigmatic. I mean, it's funny how Shadow is oftentimes considered the elusive and enigmatic one to all of the characters within the series, but to us as the audience, it's more Aurora who's really mysterious, and yet both of them still find ways to become absolute goofballs. Honestly, that's my favorite part about the series as a whole. It always finds a way to crack a joke and never really take itself too seriously despite some of the dark themes present. Anyway, that's all I have to talk about with Aurora, at least for now. I'm sure as soon as we get more of her in this series, I'll be right back to yapping about my favorite character. But for now, thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Peace.